Today we have an expert on politics and power. Neville Hillcrest is a former Canadian newspaper editor, parliamentary bureau chief, and member of the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Neville, we've learned a lot about Donald Trump over the past year. One of the defining characteristics he has is he's very good at exploiting vulnerabilities. What vulnerability did he exploit in the Republican Party?
Well, I think the first one was the inability of the Republican Party to come to a consensus early on who the nominee should be. So you had the spectacle of Donald Trump on stage with as many as, I think, 10 other people at one point or another early on in the primary process. And he took advantage of his skills, which are particularly strong in terms of television. The guy is a very good performer and came across in ways as refreshing, dynamic, straightforward, all of that kind of stuff that anybody who ever watched The Apprentice would have, seen and understood. And seeing him up on stage, there was no gap between the manufactured Trump that you saw on NBC every week for 15 years and this political actor who said he wasn't a politician showing up on stage with all these career politicians and taking them to school. So I suppose there's sort of two pieces to it then. First of all, that he was one of many and was able to exploit that and leverage a dominant position because nobody could decide who the one against Trump was going to be. If you think back to what was going on early in the primary process, early this year, and even going back to when the cable network started putting debates on a year ago, all the talk was, who is it going to be? Who would the party settle on? And the party didn't settle on any of the people who they themselves thought should be settled upon. It was, Trump was an enormously disruptive influence and ultimately persuaded actual voters that he was preferable to any of the rest of them. There was probably an opportunity to have strangled him in the cradle early on in his run, but the other guys couldn't get their act together.
Is that because if you have 10 candidates up there, you're going to have to do oppositional research on 9 of them? Which one are you going to pick? I mean, this man exceeded expectations. Do you think anyone could have foreseen the outcome and directed their money towards doing the proper research? Because they, in the sense that they could have eliminated him early on.
Nobody took him seriously. That's the issue, is that he wasn't taken seriously, and I think by the party until it was too late. And that, in some respects, is the ultimate vulnerability that the party demonstrated, was that it wasn't collectively, the people who were running the campaigns of Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio and John Kasich and the rest of them didn't understand that they were up against a force that was far greater than they gave it credit for.
What vulnerabilities did he exploit to get where he, is actually within 2 percentage points in some polls of reaching the White House?
Well, I think I don't know about exploiting vulnerabilities in as much as Donald Trump is doing what any other Republican would have done, which is to, take advantage of the various, pratfalls that Hillary Clinton has endured in a very long time in public life. If you think about it this way, anybody who comes into the public eye seeking high office, very few people are shooting stars, right? They don't come out of nowhere. As a result, somebody's persona is built up over years and decades in some instances. Like you think of somebody like, in the Canadian context, somebody like John Turner, who was the heir apparent of the Liberal Party of Canada for, the better part of a decade after he resigned as finance minister, on the basis of, his looks, his performance in his portfolio under Pierre Trudeau. And when he came back, it was very obvious there was a lot of rust on him, but people wanted to believe what Brian Mulroney called, the guy who was, the liberal dream. His greatest adversary, Jean Chrétien, the little guy from Shawinigan thing, sort of began as something that he was. That's where he came from, but he was able to, build up nearly 3 decades of political goodwill on the basis of a guy, and of goodwill, and on the basis of a guy who, on the outside seemed unable to speak either official language properly, who had a kind of down market charm, but in fact was one of the most astute political actors this country has produced in the last half of the 20th century, and was able to draw on that political goodwill to win 3 elections. So when you think about Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, sort of take the long view. Donald Trump is somebody who has been under construction for a long time. And the only thing that sets him apart from the average politician is that his route to where he is now went through reality television for 15 years. So he's on your screen, once a week, being this guy, being, the construct of, the businessman in control, the alpha male, clear ideas, clear leadership, all of those sorts of things. And that's him. There's another sort of Donald Trump, which is the actual person, but for the average person watching, that frames who the guy is. Think about Hillary Clinton now, somebody who has been in the public eye since she gave the commencement address at Wellesley as a senior in the late 60s, and goes on to a very high-profile life as the wife of a very high-profile politician that reaches its climax as being First Lady for 8 years, and then goes on to the Senate, goes on to Secretary of State. This is somebody who has an incredibly long public record and has been a polarizing personality for a really long time. So when you talk about Trump exploiting vulnerabilities, he merely has to go to the record in some ways when it comes to Hillary Clinton and needle away at it. And she has a way of doing things that Donald Trump doesn't need to be the one who points this out, but lots of others have. That her way of being as a political actor rubs a lot of people the wrong way, and so that's a vulnerability. I mean, every politician has their vulnerabilities, but there aren't too many who have a record that makes people as suspicious of them as Hillary Clinton.
So in terms of Donald Trump's vulnerability, we know that one of her catchphrases that came from Elizabeth Warren is that he can be baited with a tweet.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anything else? I mean, is it to his advantage that he has no track record as a politician, that the only thing they can go at is his behavior as opposed to his record? Well,
the thing that, Trump's counter-argument, which has been remarkably effective and I think probably has made many people who oppose him crazy, is that, he argues that what he does in business isn't what he would do in politics. What he does in business is the instinctive behavior of every businessman. Look out for yourself, make money, advance your own personal interest. And what others who have deeper experience on the public side of life argue that one's behavior generally would probably be a fair indication of what it would be if he were to hold office of any variety. So, you can point out all of the things that, tarnish Donald Trump's record, and it's a long list. And it's as if none of those things count in the eyes of his supporters. And that makes people who oppose him crazy.
And that brings me to another point that you had mentioned earlier about the down market charm that Jean Chrétien had.
Mm-hmm.
And he used that to very good effect against John Turner. We have a similar situation here. We've seen Hillary on the stump. She's, she's not very compelling. She really needs her surrogates to get out there and rouse a crowd. It's not one of her defining characteristics, is being able to bring enthusiasm to her speeches. We have Donald Trump, and I'm wondering, I'd just be curious to get your take on this, in an age where people seem to be craving authenticity, which is almost like copy and paste journalism. The communication is one to many. You can just tell by watching any party on any given day what talking points they've been given. They all use the same phrases. They repeat the same thing again and again, regardless of what questions are. And there's Trump going off script all the time. He's even been self-deprecating on the rare occasions he's self-deprecating about going off script. This is a guy who has, and also I have to say, he's used social media in a way that no other candidate has used before. And he's 70 years old. He's not a millennial, leveraging this technology to his advantage. So do you see this particular campaign and whether he wins or not, having an impact on future presidential election campaigns and how they approach it in terms of appealing to the electorate?
These are very specific and unusual circumstances and unusual candidates at the top of each ticket, because there's no historical precedent for either candidate being as unpopular as these two are. It's not like, the fact that Donald Trump manages to maintain the support of, between 85 and 90% of all Republicans, whoop-de-doo, right? Like, Mitt Romney, John McCain, both lost with most Republicans in their back pocket. It's other people they need to persuade to get them over the top.
So the fact that he's signed up more Republicans than, I believe, any other candidate doesn't translate to the general election.
Well, if he loses, electorate. It sure doesn't, no.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he still has to win. I think is interesting about, Trump's behavior is that and I don't know whether this will find life in some, the next one who comes along, who's Trumpian, is, his Twitter account. I mean, he's not the guy sitting up necessarily at 3 a.m. sending out those tweets. I mean, there are people who control his Twitter account. They have this stuff preloaded. It gets fired out all times of day. So, and I think it's fair to say that, those messages have been approved by Donald Trump because they're out under his name on his official account. So, and I think it's fair to say that, those messages have been approved by Donald Trump because they're out under his name on his official account. They have not been afraid, the Trump campaign, to say what would be, in polite company, considered things that are politically incorrect, and I mean that almost in the literal sense, that, would be seen to be self-damaging, but he gets away with it. And that appeals to his base because they feel the same way. He, as he said at the convention, "I'm your voice." And for a lot of these people who are falling in behind him, he embodies their encyclopedia of resentments that are driving him on a daily basis. It's a remarkably. It's the antithesis of the campaign that Obama ran in 2008.
So how important is big data?
The interesting thing about the United States compared to Canada is that in the mechanics of politics, the access, if you have a bit of money, and if you have a lot of money, it's even better. If you've got the cash, you can buy huge amounts of data, whether it's census, marketing, elections data, very granular stuff. You can do, and then you cross-reference that against your own focus groups, your own polling, public polling, and build a really rich understanding of what people think, where they live, what they do, what they want, and what might motivate them. And so, both campaigns are, have their own ways of scrubbing all of this data and coming to conclusions about how to convince people to vote for them or convince people not to vote for the other guy, and try to convince them to give you money and convince you to actually get out there and vote. And all of those things, like the real sort of central, the bottom line thing about politics and elections is getting people to come out and vote for you. That's the ultimate goal, because you want to be in power. And as long as there have been elections, candidates have used whatever means necessary or available to try to understand voters and then convince them. So big data is it's enormously important to them.
Well, in this election, we're hearing that the Democrats had a huge advantage, and Donald Trump's campaign team says that they see things otherwise.
Well, the advantages are. It depends on what you mean by advantage. what I think the conventional wisdom holds that the Clinton campaign has a huge advantage in terms of vote delivery on election day. They have field offices, way more field offices in contested states. They have a lot more people working for them. They seem to have the means, the physical means, to knock on the doors, to give the rides, to doing sort of face-to-face voter ID and all that kind of stuff, which is really critical.
So they have a better ground game.
And what the Trump people argue is, be that as it may, they think they have kind of tweaked the way we look at what voters think and have come to the conclusion, at least publicly stated right now, and that it might be spin, but this is what they're saying, that they think they have more vote out there than, for instance, public polling would reveal. That there are people out there who are not publicly identifying as Trump voters, but will in fact vote for Trump on election day.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of coverage on the Republicans and the Supreme Court. I mean, that's been they figured would be one of the motivating factors to get people out, and I think has swung people on side again with Trump, who were initially against him. They really want to hit the judicial branch. However, the Democrats have been equally as vitriolic with their response to that by saying if they get into power and the Republicans try to stop them, it's obstructionism and they can charge them. Do you think it's both sides are equally as responsible for the tone that's set now and potentially the day after? Or do you think the Republicans have actually, under Donald Trump or with Donald Trump or beside Donald Trump or not going against Donald Trump, created this acrimony and actually this kind of doomsday scenario that some people are predicting if they lose, they're going to be up in arms?
Well, I mean, acrimony has been part of American politics going back a very long time. So that there's an acrimonious relationship between the parties and their supporters isn't, now versus, I don't know, leading up to the Civil War, for instance, when really nothing got done in Congress for the better part of 7 or 8 years. Leading up to the election of Abraham Lincoln. The rhetoric on the GOP side and the Trump side has been more incendiary and apocalyptic than I would say it has been among Democrats, except to say, I guess my one caveat is that, what they warn of in the event of a Trump victory, which is where they get apocalyptic.
I would like to just kind of get your thoughts on how you think historians, say 50 years from now, will look back on this election, what some of the defining features of it will be in terms of their analysis.
That's a good question. Well, I mean, if they turn around and if the United States elects the first woman, that's the takeaway. I think people will, political professionals, and I think historians will look at this campaign like it's going to get a lot of scrutiny over time because it's been so unusual. We will learn over time a lot about, particularly I think, how the Trumps kind of did it. Because right now it's like we're still trying to understand just the basic mechanics of their campaign and who's been making decisions and how it's been done. And I think the assumption on the part of most people is it's sort of Donald winging it. I'm not entirely convinced that it's that case at all. That there's been a mind meld with certain individuals at the top end of the campaign who driven it along, but it's going to take a little time for that to get teased out and really understood. On the sort of the broader sort of historical sweep of it all, I wonder if historians will look back on this as, especially if he wins, as a moment where like something really big and bad happened. That there was a change that took the country down a road that is a marked departure from where it has ever been. But this one's going to get chewed over pretty well.
Neville Hillcrest, I'd like to thank you for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge with me.
You're welcome.